Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal. Marco stood frozen, his eyes wide in disbelief at the horrific scene before him. Natalia, the woman he had once loved, was now lifeless, sprawled across the couch in an eerie stillness. The pungent scent of alcohol filled the air, and beside her lay a nearly empty bottle of liquor, with only a faint trace of its contents left. Scattered across the floor were pills, remnants of a calculated, slow death. It felt like a nightmare, something beyond belief. Natalia, the strong, resilient woman he had known, was gone. Marco could hardly comprehend it. This wasn't the ending he'd imagined for her, not after everything they had been through. In the first moments, a deep, boiling rage surged inside him. Even though he knew that nothing could change what had happened, the sense of loss was too overwhelming to ignore. His mind raced as the only question he could form was, who did this to her? Marco wasn't one to easily accept a painful truth, and as memories of the countless confrontations between Sunny and Natalia flooded back, he couldn't help but suspect that it was Sunny who had driven her to this tragic fate. Sunny, with his immense power and control over everyone around him, had always been a force of nature. The thought that Natalia, in her desperation to escape Port Charles, could have been pushed too far by him was unsettling. Marco found it almost impossible to believe that this was anything but a consequence of Sunny's anger. Had the mob boss snapped? Was this the outcome of years of tension and manipulation? Was this Sunny's doing, an explosive outburst that led to Natalia's cruel demise? But as Marco started to piece together the clues scattered around the room, something didn't add up. The bottle of alcohol that Natalia had consumed wasn't just ordinary liquor, it was laced with something far more sinister. And the pills, they weren't simply carelessly discarded. They had been carefully placed, mixed, as if orchestrated for a specific purpose. Marco bent down, his heart racing, inspecting the remnants of the poison. The chemical traces were unmistakable, this wasn't an accidental overdose. The substance in the drink was a powerful sedative, capable of rendering someone unconscious and leading them to an agonizing death. His chest tightened as the realization hit him. It wasn't Sunny. The mob boss was not the culprit here. Someone else was behind this, someone who had meticulously set this trap, playing the game with chilling precision. The more Marco looked around, the more he understood the manipulation at play. Whoever was responsible had not only arranged everything with terrifying foresight, but they had also ensured that suspicion would fall squarely on Sunny. It was a perfect setup. The ambiguity of the situation. Natalia's tumultuous relationship with Sunny, her desire to escape, her growing bitterness towards him, had all been exploited to create the ideal smokescreen. The real perpetrator had carefully crafted a story that could fool anyone, even someone like Marco, into believing that Sunny had been the one to push Natalia over the edge. But now Marco knew better. This was no random act of violence, no impulsive reaction from an angry man. This was calculated, cold-blooded. The person who had done this was hiding in plain sight, their plan unfolding exactly as they'd intended. Marco's mind raced with possibilities. Who stood to gain from Natalia's death? Who had the means, the knowledge, and the motive to pull off such a cruel and methodical plot? And most importantly, why use Natalia as a pawn in such a twisted game? He could feel the walls closing in on him, the weight of the situation pressing down on him with every passing second. Every instinct screamed at him to find the truth, to expose the person who had turned his world upside down. But the more Marco thought about it, the more he realized just how deeply entwined this conspiracy was with everyone around him. His next move was clear. He couldn't let Natalia's death be swept under the rug, nor could he allow the wrong person to take the fall. He had to dig deeper, to uncover the true mastermind behind this tragedy. But doing so meant facing down an unseen enemy, someone who had already shown their ability to manipulate, deceive, and control. Marco couldn't trust anyone, not Sunny, not even his closest allies, because the true culprit had already infiltrated the circle. Marco's thoughts turned dark. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. The stakes were higher now, and he knew that every move he made could lead him closer to the truth. Or deeper into the web of lies spun by the person who had orchestrated this nightmare. The pain of losing Natalia was unbearable, but that pain was now twisted with a burning desire for justice. He couldn't let her death be in vain. No matter what it took, he would find the one responsible and make them pay. Marco felt utterly deceived, manipulated by the very emotions and anger that had built up within him over the past months. The truth, something he had once believed to be so straightforward, was now buried beneath layers of lies, and he found himself consumed by a profound sense of betrayal. The person behind this elaborate scheme was someone far more devious than he could have imagined. This individual had plotted every detail with meticulous care, moving pieces on the chessboard like a master strategist, all the while using Sonny as nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game. Marco's stomach twisted with the bitter realization that he had been played, and the weight of his mistake grew heavier by the second. He had been so sure of his suspicions, so certain that he could uncover the truth and bring the one responsible for Natalia's death to justice. But now, he felt as though he had wandered into an abyss of lies so vast that he had no idea which way to turn. The person behind all of this had woven a web so intricate, so perfect in its execution, that Marco could hardly see the path forward. Each new revelation only seemed to bury him deeper in confusion and doubt, as if the truth had been deliberately obscured from him. The guilt and regret gnawed at Marco relentlessly, like a persistent shadow refusing to leave his side. Every decision, every moment that had led him to this point, played out in his mind like an endless loop, a constant reminder of how easily he had been deceived. He thought of all the times he had allowed his anger towards Sonny to cloud his judgment, how he had let the animosity between them fuel his suspicions. How many times had he dismissed his gut instincts in favor of the narrative that seemed so obvious at the time. The guilt weighed on him, suffocating him with the knowledge that, if he had seen through the lies sooner, perhaps things could have been different. As he paced through the dimly lit room, the faces of those he loved, and the memories of Natalia, the woman he had once shared so much with, haunted him. She had gone out in the most tragic way possible, alone and in despair. He could almost hear her voice, the pain in her words as she realized her life had slipped away. The image of her lying lifeless on the couch, her final breath snuffed out in such a quiet, brutal manner, made Marco's heart ache with an intensity he had never felt before. The memory of her smile, her strength, her laughter, now reduced to nothing more than an echo in his mind. It was unbearable, and yet, it pushed him forward, driving him to find out who had stolen her from him, from everyone who had cared about her. But even as Marco vowed to seek justice for Natalia, he was painfully aware that time was running out. Every passing second brought him closer to the realization that the one who had orchestrated this murder was still out there, watching, waiting. If Marco didn't act swiftly, if he didn't uncover the true culprit soon, this shadowy figure would slip away into the darkness, untouched and unpunished. The possibility that the person who had stolen Natalia's life could simply disappear into the ether was too much for Marco to bear. The very thought made his blood run cold. He wouldn't, allow it. As the weight of the situation continued to press down on him, Marco felt his mind race with 1,000 thoughts. Port Charles would never be the same again. It had already been forever changed by Natalia's death, but now the city was on the brink of unraveling. Her death had not only left a massive void in the hearts of those who loved her, but it had also stirred up old secrets, darkened alliances, and broken relationships. The people who had once walked the streets of Port Charles with a sense of security and routine were now standing on the edge of a precipice. Marco knew this would be the beginning of something far more chaotic, something that would alter the course of everyone's lives. The truth, he realized, was buried somewhere in the depths of this twisted game. It wasn't just about justice for Natalia anymore. It was about uncovering the dark forces that had been manipulating everyone, including him. It was about exposing the corruption and betrayal that had been festering beneath the surface for far too long. Marco understood now that he wasn't just seeking the truth for Natalia. He was seeking it for himself. For everyone who had been wronged, for everyone who had suffered because of lies and deceit. But as much as he wanted to rush ahead and tear down every stone in his path, Marco knew he couldn't. He had to be methodical, strategic. The person behind all of this had thought of everything. They were a master of deception, and Marco knew that if he moved too quickly or carelessly, he would fall right into their hands. This was a battle of wits, of patience, and of nerve. The stakes were higher than they had ever been, and the clock was ticking. Each passing moment felt like a weight on his chest. But in the midst of his desperation, Marco found a glimmer of resolve. He couldn't undo the past, but he could control the future. He could uncover the truth, and he would make sure the person responsible for Natalia's death would pay for their sins. There was no turning back now. This was his fight, and he would see it through, no matter what it cost him. When the news of Natalia's death spread through Port Charles, it sent shockwaves through the entire community. The grief of her loss wasn't just felt by her family, but by everyone who had known her. Although their relationship had never been embraced by the fans, the controversial romance between her and Sonny Corinthos had ignited endless debates. Some had resented Natalia for being involved with Sonny, a man whose reputation had already divided the town. Others had viewed her as the outsider, the one who had never quite fit in, never truly been accepted by the tight-knit world of Port Charles. Yet now, with her sudden death, all the anger and resentment seemed to dissipate, replaced by an overwhelming sense of confusion and disbelief. The question that lingered in the air was the same for everyone: who was responsible for this tragedy? As the authorities began their investigation, the town became a powder keg of suspicions, rumors, and accusations. Everyone who had ever crossed paths with Natalia now found themselves under a harsh light. Old grudges resurfaced, and the thin veneer of civility in Port Charles began to crack. Those who had once envied or hated Natalia now questioned whether they had missed something crucial. Could someone they knew be capable of such a crime? And perhaps more importantly, would the truth ever be revealed? The idea that Natalia's death could remain shrouded in mystery made the residents uneasy, and for many, the idea of justice slipping through their fingers was a terrifying thought. Meanwhile, Marco, overwhelmed with sorrow and consumed by a thirst for revenge, began to map out his plan. Natalia's death had left a gaping wound in his heart, one that wouldn't heal with time alone. He could feel the flames of anger burning hotter with each passing day. The betrayal, the lies, the painful reality of her untimely death, it all pushed Marco forward, determined to bring the one responsible to justice. He was resolute, his mind set on one goal: finding the person who had taken Natalia away from him, from all of them, and making them pay. But as he began to dig deeper into the mystery, Marco realized that the path to the truth would not be as simple as he had hoped. Port Charles, with all its hidden secrets, was more complicated than he had ever imagined. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that those around him, those he trusted, might not be who they appeared to be. The world Natalia had been a part of was far more twisted than he had ever anticipated. Marco began to understand that the person behind Natalia's death might be someone he least expected, someone he never would have thought capable of such cruelty. It could be a familiar face, someone close to him, someone he had trusted. The web of deception stretched far wider than Marco could have ever imagined, and as he sought out answers, he was forced to confront painful truths. Every relationship in Port Charles seemed tainted, every ally could potentially be a traitor. The people he had once considered allies, even friends, might hold the key to unlocking the mystery of Natalia's death. And with each new revelation, the stakes became higher, and the danger more real. Marco found himself standing on the precipice of a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could either continue his quest for justice, no matter the personal cost, or he could walk away, accepting the unknown, and let the secrets of Port Charles remain hidden forever. But Marco wasn't one to back down from a challenge, not when it came to the memory of the woman he loved. He knew that the truth had to be uncovered, and it would require every ounce of his strength, determination, and cunning to make it happen. As the days dragged on, the tension in Port Charles grew, and Marco's resolve only hardened. He had to face the fact that the journey ahead would be full of peril, and he would have to navigate the dangerous waters of betrayal, deceit, and manipulation. With each step, Marco moved closer to the truth, but at what cost? Would he be able to handle the consequences of uncovering the secrets that had been buried for so long? Or would the truth destroy everything he held dear? As the investigation continued and the shadows of Port Charles grew darker, Marco was forced to confront the most difficult decision of all: how far was he willing to go to find the truth? With each passing day, Marco felt the mounting pressure, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him like a suffocating fog. Everything around him, his every move, every conversation, seemed to grow more entangled, more complex, more unpredictable than it had ever been. Port Charles, a town he thought he knew inside and out, had transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and deceit. Every corner he turned, every person he spoke to, seemed to hide a truth he wasn't yet ready to face. But despite the confusion swirling around him, there was one undeniable fact that Marco held on to with unwavering conviction. Natalia did not deserve to die in such a cruel, isolated way. Her life had been stolen, and he wouldn't, let the people responsible escape justice. His mind raced as the days dragged on, thoughts of Natalia's untimely death consuming him. The image of her lifeless body on that couch, the finality of it all, was something Marco couldn't shake. He knew deep down that Natalia's death wasn't just the result of a tragic accident, it was a calculated, deliberate act. Someone had taken her life, and they had done it with cold precision. But the more he investigated, the more the web of lies around him seemed to expand, wrapping itself tighter and tighter around his every move. Nothing was clear anymore, and the lines between friend and foe blurred with each passing hour. Marco had always prided himself on his ability to trust his instincts. He had navigated the treacherous world of Port Charles for years, building alliances and making enemies, but always with a sense of clarity. Yet now, every step felt like a misstep. Who could he trust? Who was feeding him lies? The more he dug into the lives of those around him, the more he realized just how deep the deception ran. It wasn't just about finding Natalia's killer anymore, it was about surviving the storm that was coming. The people who had pulled the strings behind her death were still lurking in the shadows, and Marco was beginning to realize that they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. But there was one thing that kept him going through the endless hours of frustration and confusion: the memory of Natalia. He could still hear her laughter, still feel her presence in the air around him, as if she was urging him on, telling him not to give up. She had been a fighter, a woman who had faced adversity with strength and grace. She didn't deserve to go out like this, alone and abandoned, taken by someone who had seen her as nothing more than a pawn in a twisted game. Marco's resolve hardened with every passing day. He couldn't let her death go unanswered. Not now, not ever. Every decision he made, every move he took, was now consumed by one singular purpose: to find the truth. But the more he uncovered, the more he understood that this wasn't going to be a simple task. The stakes were higher than he could have imagined. The forces at play in Port Charles were powerful, and they weren't going to let a single life slip through their fingers without a fight. Marco knew that whatever he uncovered in the coming days could have devastating consequences. He had already lost so much, and he knew that pushing forward could cost him everything else he held dear. But that didn't matter anymore. He had a mission, and nothing would stand in his way. He would tear apart every lie, dismantle every falsehood, until he found the person who had robbed Natalia of her future. Whether it was someone close to him, someone he trusted, or someone he never even suspected, Marco was determined to bring them to justice. The pain and anger that had been building inside him for so long now propelled him forward. He couldn't allow the truth to stay hidden any longer. As the days wore on, Marco's mind began to piece together the puzzle. Slowly, carefully, he started to see the connections, the patterns that had eluded him at first. It was as if the pieces of the puzzle were finally beginning to fit together, and Marco could feel the walls closing in on the person responsible for Natalia's death. But he knew that each step closer to the truth would only make things more dangerous. The enemy, whoever it was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Marco was ready. He couldn't afford to hesitate any longer. Every moment that passed brought him closer to the truth, and to the reckoning he had been preparing for. He would not rest until he uncovered the full extent of the betrayal that had cost Natalia her life. And when he did, he would make sure that the person responsible paid the price for their actions. Marco was determined to bring justice to the woman he had loved, and he would stop at nothing to make sure that her death was not in vain. The clock was ticking, and the tension in Port Charles was building, but Marco knew that his fight for the truth was just beginning.